Our sermon is this 1 Peter passage that has a whole multi-year story about it. Something that in our last MLT meeting, Dustin pointed out in me is I tend to spend a whole lot of time on this idea of what does it mean to obey God? And what does it mean to, in essence, be perfect? And I like to question the boundaries of what does it mean to be good enough, and what does it mean to be perfect, and what does it mean to be sinless. And so I spent a lot of times talking about these high theology type of things that I try to distill them down into a topic that, into a way that I can apply them in my lives, and hopefully from the pulpit, help you apply them into yours. That is the goal here. And as I was thinking about it, and we are going through Hebrews, I kind of had this image in my head about sin. And my legal name is Kyle, and we have people here young enough. You know the Kyle memes, right? White Claw monster, pocket knife, drywall, hates their parents. Like, am I the only one that knows that? I might be the only one that knows that, mostly because in Texas I got ridiculed by that tons. But I was viewing my life, and I was looking at sin, and one day an image came to me, and I had this image of this brand new white wall in this cosmic house I was living in. And I'm a kid with a marker or a Sharpie or a guy named Kyle with a White Claw and a pocket knife. And I see that white wall and I'm like, ooh, let me do something to it. The perfect example is oftentimes if you look at the end of the service, we have a whiteboard back in this corner and it is covered. Because when there's a blank wall and a marker to write on it, oftentimes there's this urge to go be artistic and express yourself. However, if I'm a tenant in this cosmic house, I'm supposed to take care of my white wall. But here I am with my Sharpie, and I have this urge to just draw all over it, and I succumb to that urge. And in my life, years, through my childhood, that wall becomes dark and ruined and blackened, and whatever color was underneath it is hidden. Until one day, God comes in and says, hey, let me fix that. You destroyed my wall. Let me fix that. And instead of just painting over the wall, he rebuilds the wall as if I never put a mark on it in the first place. It is a brand new wall. Think of the most beautiful wall you can think of in this minute expression. White wall, eggshell wall, peach wall, pink wall, wallpapered something. But however, it's new, and it's as if I never marked on it in the first place. But I'm still sitting there with my Sharpie, and I still have this urge to write all over that wall. Our map today is this conversation of God is the best cosmic landlord, an attitude of gratitude, and then do, specifically in italics, something. And if you're a note taker, I'm taking an example from Dustin to try to help center myself. My main point today is looking at perfection, such that perfection is doing something with our salvation for the sake of our own character and the well-being of those around us. So let us begin with this idea of that God is the best cosmic landlord. I kind of hinted toward it in my story, that little beginning, but God is the best cosmic landlord, such that I am renting this life, this wall, this house. I am just a tenant, blessed with the privilege to live in a good life and a good house. But I am sitting there with a marker, marking up my wall, and God comes in and says, wow, you really destroyed my property. But you know what? I'm going to rebuild it for you, and I'm going to give it to you again, and you get to live in this house still. And I'm going to make this house as if you never marked on it in the first place. And then me as a tenant, I'm like, great, I get this house, and then that Sharpie comes out of my pocket, or that crayon, or whatever I do to mar that wall up. The hammer, the pocket knife, whatever in my mind turns that wall into an expression of me and not an expression of God I want to do. So I sit there, holding my marker at bay. And this leads me to a quote by none other than Daniel Minter, that sin is pesky. In this expression, if you haven't figured out, the marker and the marks I make, that's my sin. Let me not hit my mic. That is my sin, and sin is pesky. Even though as I grow and I mature, I eventually gain the self-control to not mark on the wall, as hopefully as we do as we grow up, it's pesky. And every now and then I have those impulsive thoughts of like, oh, what if I just dragged something along that wall and look at that line? So sin has a way of staying with us despite us being forgiven. And we live in this paradox of I am clean and made whole and covered by the blood of Jesus, and then I still mess up. I'm forgiven today and I sin tomorrow, and that's tough. Because as our passage is eventually going to tell us again, God says, be holy as I am holy. Many translations say, be perfect as I am perfect. And tomorrow I'm going to mess up no matter how much I'm forgiven today. And that is tough for me to grapple with. I suspect it's tough for some of you to grapple with. And oftentimes it leads us into these discussions of perfectionism and legalism, or in some extreme cases, oh, sin is just absolved from my character. And I don't know what the answer, I hopefully am presenting an answer, but like coming into this conversation, that it's really tough to create an answer to this conversation because it's so broad, and it's that, again, that paradox of God calls us to perfection inside of our forgiveness. But tomorrow I'm going to mess up and I need that forgiveness again. Part of me wants to continuously right and mar and mess up that which has been made whole. And that terrifies me. Peter writes to us in 1 Peter 1, starting in verse 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. What Peter presents to us here, he says, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. And what he tells us is that knowing God changes something within us. I suspect what it is that before we know Jesus, in our hearts, we don't know that we're sinning. And when we meet Jesus, we are removed of that ignorance, and then we realize, oh, I am messing up, and I can't do it myself. Our ignorance about what we're doing is removed. And this is put into this idea of you shall be holy for God is holy. You shall be perfect for God is perfect. And he quotes Leviticus 11:44, which is a little odd. The quote from Leviticus 11:44 is just simply, you shall be holy as I am holy. But it's a little odd because it's a food law conversation. It's don't eat certain foods, eat these foods. Don't prepare your food this way, prepare it this way. You shall be holy as God is holy. And then Peter uses it here in the concept of sin. And it's a little odd. And when we distill down the conversation, holiness, this perfect, what this really means, the word comes down to this definition, just being set apart. You've heard this probably again and again in church. It's a very common word that pastors like to define. Holy is being set apart. And so you shall be set apart as I am set apart. You shall be different as I am different. In Leviticus, we have this conversation of Israel being different than the culture surrounding them. In this conversation with Peter, God is saying, I'm going to create a people that are unique and different from the people around them. We're creating a people that are set apart. And this is where the conversation of perfectionism and legalism comes into play. Because where discrimination of food products was not the point was to create a unique people. And once we create something different, some people have this urge of rebellion, and some people have this urge of definition. I want to put a box around what different means, and I want to rebel against different. And the church has dealt with this for 2,000 years. You know, the original church, as we know, Israel, the Old Testament, Jesus came onto the scene. Non-Jews were allowed into the ministry, into the church. Gentiles came in, and the Gentiles like, we don't do your food laws. We don't dress the way you do. We don't talk the way you do. And the Jews said, you should. If you're going to be Christian, you should behave like this. And so the church argued about it. And this turned into the conversation that you read about in Acts 15 about the Jerusalem Council, where there was a big debate over what happens to Gentiles, non-Jews, when they become Christian, when they meet Jesus. What do they do? And in our book, it's just a small paragraph. in reality, this was a big fundamental step. This was one of the first big decisions that the early church ever made, was how do we represent God amongst these people that weren't originally among God's chosen people? And the conclusion happens in Acts 15, 19 through 21. Therefore, my judgment, and this is James speaking, is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. See, the Jews thought that by allowing the Gentiles in and not putting them under Jewish ritual law, the biggest example is circumcision, they thought that we are throwing away the Torah, we are throwing away the Old Testament, that all that history was gone. And the Gentiles thought, well, we're just not like you. We weren't part of you. We're not ethnically the same as you. And so the conversation was, how much law do we push on to the Gentiles? How much of the Israel image perfection do we push on to other people? The apostles came together, the church elders came together and said, hey, these people are different. They aren't like us. They weren't born into our religion. What does God actually want from the law? And they simplified it that you shouldn't get involved with idols. You should not do sexual immorality. You should think about holy things about life. And that's where that strangle and blood comes from. We should respect life. And these three things are all that me as a Gentile need to do on top of my relationship with Jesus to be a good Christian according to the Jerusalem Council. But there's this line in here that kind of tells the Jews that we're not throwing away the law. It still exists. We're just distilling it down to its main points. It says that in every generation, Moses' law has still always been read. And in every generation, there has been witnesses who proclaim it. And on Sabbath, he's still read in the synagogues. So these three distillations, don't get involved with idols, don't be sexually immoral, respect life in your food. These fulfill the law according to the Jerusalem Council. And so because of that, and especially in this conversation with Peter, the law was not abolished and sin was still not allowed, even though this box of perfection, Israelite perfection, was removed from the Gentiles. It doesn't mean the law was removed from the Gentiles. What it really means is that the Gentiles are more called to character growth than they were ritual growth. They were called to changing their heart and how they view things, how they view idols, how they view their body, how they view life, more than they were called to a ritualistic understanding of what God wants. Character growth alone was enough to create holiness in the person, according to what the council tells us. As Jesus points out, oftentimes it's the inside that makes the vessel unclean, not the outside. And they're just applying that in this situation by saying it's what our heart expresses that entertains and influences our actions, not our actions that influence our heart. We talked about in Hebrews a lot too, just to kind of hammer in this point. One of the tough things about Hebrews is we have a lot of conversations about this idea of what does it mean to turn from the faith? And Dustin, Jeremiah, and I hope that one of the things that we got across is those passages were less about what happens if you turn away from the faith and more about a pleading to the people to stay in line, to stay ready, to stay stubborn towards Jesus. One of the biggest ones that I found in here is Hebrews 10. And just as a review, we're going to read through it again. And it says, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." Now that terrifies me. It says, if I go on willingly sinning, I'm going to expect the judgment of someone who's not saved in the first place. However, just like Peter writes, the author of Hebrews says that with salvation comes a knowledge, except here he defines it as truth. We have a knowledge of truth when we meet Jesus. We find something new, something real. We find the truth and we get to internalize it into our hearts. And that's our salvation. More importantly, that pre-salvation, we have been lied to. Post-salvation, we now no longer lie to. We have the honest, the best cosmic landlord coming down to save us. Also in this passage, as with the Jerusalem Council, the law still exists, and if I push away the law, I'm going to be under judgment. So both things still sit there. Continuing on in Hebrews, how much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and who has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? There's this conversation of when people had the law of Moses, they had this written law that I could sit there and say, I interpret it this way, or I disagree with that wording, and I could justify in my mind a way to turn away from the law. But now I have the Christ. I have the law incarnate in the person coming to me, God standing in front of me saying, but I love you and I forgive you. And if I turn from that, how much worse will my punishment be? The law has now come in love and embodied in a thing that can hug me and love me personally. This reminded me as I was writing through this conversation a long time ago, it feels like. A few buildings ago, it feels like. We went through spiritual disciplines. And in study, I brought up two issues with this concept of knowledge and ignorance and malice and evil. First is Hanlon's razor. And it says, never assume malice when incompetence will suffice as an explanation. Basically, don't assume I'm intentionally doing something wrong to you. I might just be ignorant of what I'm doing. And then Fred Clark's law. Eventually, sufficiently advanced incompetence is indistinguishable from malice. That simplifies down to, if I allow myself to say ignorance, eventually my wrongdoing is going to be as if I'm doing it intentionally. So again, I have to hold in tension these ideas. Sometimes I'm doing wrong just because I don't know. But if I never try to learn, then eventually that wrongdoing is true wrongdoing. I'm actually being evil and malice and malicious. My take on it, when I combine the two, is you can't fix what you don't know. But to avoid learning of your mistakes is even worse. What Hebrews and Peter is trying to tell us is what happens when I learn of my mistakes but take no opportunity, no try to change who I am, to learn from those mistakes and do something different. What happens when I finally experience forgiveness and I finally learn truth and I don't try to make a change in my life? This happened a few weeks ago. Daniel's going to be infatuated inside of my sermon. But a few weeks ago, we were having a life group leader dinner, and we were having an informal conversation. If I'm remembering correctly, it was about the public library, and Daniel was expressing his desire that there either be a new space or that the public library be transformed into a more influential space in our neighborhood. It wouldn't just be a space I maybe go to read books and check one out, or maybe just get free internet, or maybe just get out of the cold, but it'd be a little bit more of a cornerstone in our neighborhood. And he kept putting up these ideas, and in the moment I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, but I just kept saying, well, Daniel, we have that. And then he'd have another idea. Oh, we have that here. We have another idea. We have that here. And inside of our life group guidelines, if you've been around some of our groups, you've heard these enough, we have this guideline of don't rescue or fix. And don't rescue or fix is the language of have you tried this, have you tried that, and dismissal. And that's all I was doing to Daniel. I was just dismissing his ideas, saying, we've already had it, your ideas are worthless. In the moment, I wasn't thinking that. In the moment, I was just having an informal conversation with my friend. And I thought we were exchanging ideas. And I went home ignorant of what I had done. But Daniel and I have a call, 6:30 the next morning. Early, I know. And he tells me how much I hurt him and how I made him feel dismissed. And I had an option there. I had an option to say, oh man, I was wrong. Thank you for pointing out for me. I'm going to try to change. I had an option to be fully just, oh, I didn't know. Thank you for letting me know. And then not changing at all. And this is where that idea of ignorance and malice and evil comes in. If I had just gone, if Daniel didn't inform me what I was doing wrong, eventually my ignorance and my actions would lead to more damaging situations in other relationships later on. If I began to know and then continued to do those things without trying to change, then I'd just be trampling on the friendship that Daniel and I have. Both these things really seem to me exactly what Peter and the author of Hebrews are trying to tell us. If I don't know, and I continue to strive to don't know, I'm eventually going to do something really stupid. But if I do know and never try to change, that's just as bad, if not worse. Hebrews tells us and finishes up this passage that now that God has revealed the truth of us, remember, for we know who said that vengeance is mine and I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. And one of the most intense pieces of scripture that I have ever read is, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I'm not talking about risking my friendship with Daniel. I'm talking about upsetting the creator, the judger, the lover and savior of the universe. Returning to 1 Peter, he tells us in verse 17, and if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourself with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you are ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers. Not with perishable things as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Like that of a lamb without blemish or spot, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of those who are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and your hope are in God. This tells us that despite deserving death, we were given grace and forgiveness, and we are to fear the God who gave us that grace and forgiveness. Now, that fear is not some jump scare in a scary movie. It's not some existential dread of, oh no, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and die. It is not the fear of walking down a back alley at midnight not knowing what's around the corner. It is reverence, and it is awe, and it is understanding that the creator of everything loves you individually. And Peter calls us to our next bullet point, an attitude of gratitude. It's cliche. It's is whippy a word? It's cliche. It's axiom that is often heard in our world. However, Peter is saying that hold in fear the God that saved you. Hold in awe that he would save you. Be grateful that the God who created and loves and judges everything saved you specifically. Not with some ransom of material wealth, but the ransom of his own blood, sweat, and tears, his life. This is why Philippians tell us it was humiliating for Jesus to become a man, because God's life is so incomprehensibly valuable, and yet God said it's worth it for you. This reminded me of a story I know there's a lot of stories, but as I'm coming through, this reminded me of a story. I spent a lot of time working in Celebrate Recovery. And in Celebrate Recovery, which is a church-based addiction ministry, in Celebrate Recovery, you go through your service, and at the very end, very similar to what you think of like NA or AA, you get a chip. And they say, hey, if you want a change in your life, come up here and get your day one chip. And this chip represents your resolution to change. You go up, you get your chip, you go sit down, they go through all the times. Like they'll do 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 5 years, just like any drug and addiction services would. At the end of it, they have another point. Because when you get your blue chip, that blue chip is your resolve to then go out the next day and not do the thing that you're promising, not do the thing you went to the service for. And let's say you go 2, 3, 4 days and you're like, yes, I didn't do it. In my example, as I was thinking about home, I was thinking like, what if I just really like punching people in the face? So I go 2 days without punching people in the face, 3 days without punching people in the face, 6 days without punching people in the face. And I'm on my way to Celebrate Recovery on that 7th day, and I just see a guy with a really punchable face. And just like my marker on the wall, I decide I'm gonna punch him in the face. Now, outside of the legal realm of this conversation, I go into CR and I'm looking at my blue chip and I'm saying, man, I went a whole week, almost, but I punched a guy in the face. I did exactly what I said I wasn't going to do. Well, at the end of the time periods of CR, they always come back and they say, hey, some of us mess up. We have a chip for that. If you want to re-resolve yourself, recommit yourself, to this life change. Come up and get it. And when you go up there, you realize it's the exact same chip as your day one chip. They say your commitment on after failing 49 days is the same as your commitment that first time you came up here. And so they call the blue chip the day one chip. They also call the blue chip the grace chip. So that as long as I'm going to service, that going to service and saying there's something wrong with me is the resolution to change, not the chip itself. And so as long as I keep coming back and keep getting that blue chip and say, man, I really want to change. And they just keep giving it. And there's no judgment towards that. And hopefully you build community and trust and someone gets to work with you so you can achieve that life change. What Peter's telling us is that we have a God who forgives us, and we should not continue doing what we once did. What Hebrews says, if you knowingly continue sinning, it's trampling on Jesus' sacrifice. However, if I go through my life and I want to please God and I do mess up, my grace chip is still there. My blue chip is still there, so I can wake up tomorrow and say, God, I messed up yesterday. I don't want to mess up anymore. Help me not mess up again. This reminds me of a story in Matthew where Jesus talks about this parable of the tenants. And what is my time? Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to paraphrase it just like we do in our life groups. If you want the reference for those who are writing notes, it's Matthew 25, 14 through 30. And it says, for it, the kingdom of heaven, it's like a man who is the Lord over land. He's going on a journey. So he pulls his servants together, 3 of them, and he says to the first servant, here's a large sum of money. I entrust this to you. He pulls his second servant forward and he says, here's a slightly smaller sum of money. I entrust this to you. And he pulls the third servant forward and says, here's the even slightly smaller money. I entrust this to you. Each of you have been given a value of wealth that I know you can handle and operate. And then he goes on the journey, which leads us to our third point. We have to do something. Because when the master goes on this journey, the first servant says, oh, I have this large sum of money. I should go do something with it. So he goes to the market, he goes to people, he goes to the banks, and he puts that money out into the community. And he doubles it. He gets stuff back. He gets interest. He gets more and more, and he's able to hold on to it. The second one does the same. He takes a slightly smaller amount of money, goes into the community, into the market, he invests it, he buys and he sells, and he doubles his value. But the third one says to himself, oh, my master's a shrewd businessman. He buys land, he doesn't work. He reaps a harvest, he did not work himself. I should just hide this. And he buries it in the ground. In our world, it'd be the equivalent of, I'm going to take my $100, I'm going to put it in my mattress. And he does nothing with it. He hides it. Well, eventually the master comes back and he calls his servants together, and the first servant says, hey, master, look, I did something with this value that you gave me and I doubled it. And that master goes, I'm so proud of you. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Rejoice in the joy of your master. The second comes to him and says the same and says, look, master, I've doubled the money that you've given me. Look how good a job I did. And the master goes, well done, my good and faithful servant. Rejoice in the joy of your master. The third guy comes and says, master, I know you're a shrewd businessman and I didn't want to risk the loss. So I buried your money and hid it. Here it is. Here's what's yours. And the master says, you slothful and disobedient servant, you could have at least put it in the bank and got me interest on it. But instead you hid it away because you knew I was a shrewd businessman. I'm going to take your wealth away and give it to the one who already has some. There's this idea that when we get our salvation and our forgiveness, that everything's going to be peachy keen the next day. What Jesus tells us is that our life and growth and character change, our perfection, is a life of risk. That if I just take that forgiveness and hold on to it and never do anything with it, that it's the equivalent of just wasting it away. If I choose tomorrow to not just intentionally sin, but to live as if I'm not saved, that's the same thing. But if we look at the first 2 servants, they risked it. They put in the open market. They tried. They showed off their salvation. They invested in other people, and they got a yield from it. And the master said, great, thank you. I trusted you, and it was worthwhile. To the last one who just held on to it and lived as if he wasn't saved. He lived as if he wasn't doing anything. The master said, you could have at least invested it in other people and got me back some interest. You could have at least put it in the banks. So the time I got back, there'd be something. But instead, you held on to it. And then, as we know from today's market, putting money in our mattress is as if just that money is going to waste away. And the master is suggesting that hiding my salvation, not doing anything with it, not even working on my own character so I can express it to other people, is as if I'm not saved in the first place. He's calling us to do something. And this is a scary story because just like the passage from Hebrews, it suggests that disobeying God and not living on our salvation results in something terrible, a weeping and gnashing of teeth. The imagery of hell that we get in the Bible. Our job is to take our salvation and to do something with it. I began this conversation, though, with this idea of perfection. And I'm ending it right here, not ending it, but I'm right here. It's just like, okay, well, let's do something. And we have to figure out a way to connect those two. And that's the conversation that I've been having with myself. The Bible calls us to do something. It calls us to be perfect. What in the world is that? I want to return to 1 Peter, because I think Peter gives us a decent answer on what doing something means. So in 1 Peter 1:22, he says, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnest and from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. That knowledge, that exchanged ignorance that Peter and the author of Hebrews tell us, that truth is sincere brotherly love. If we read Jesus' teaching, this is where Jesus distills down all of the Old Testament law into love the Lord your God with everything that you have and love your neighbor as yourself. What I'm suggesting is that in some way, somehow, as Jesus did, these fulfill the law. That perfection in God's eyes and perfection in our current salvation is loving God with everything that we have and then loving our neighbor at the sacrifice of my own self. If we do those things, there's really no way for me not to want to improve. There's really no way for God's character not to infiltrate my life. There's no way for me to continue sinning if I love God with everything that I am and I put my neighbor and the person next to me, my friends, greater than my own well-being, and I vie for theirs. Peter gives us a little urgency in this when he says, all flesh is like grass, and all of its glory is like the flowers of grass. For the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord remains forever. My body will die. Or, if we use Jesus' parable of the talents, the master will come back one day. There is an expiration date on this world, and there is an expiration date on my life. Which one comes first? I don't know. But the urgency is there that I'm supposed to love God as much as I can for as long as I can. And I'm supposed to love my neighbor as much as I can for as long as I can. Not tomorrow, not 3 years in the future, but today with the salvation that I have. And that results in my growth. Because this is the word of good news that was preached to you, continuing on into 1 Peter 2. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. I find that one of the reasons that I feel like I'm heading in the right direction on perfection and sin is because Peter defines the opposite of holiness here as malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slanders, all the things that I would do to someone else. All the things that I would do to my neighbor that wouldn't be loving them. Lying to you wouldn't be loving you. Bad-mouthing you wouldn't be loving you. Being jealous of the things you have wouldn't be loving you. Being having hypocrisy towards you wouldn't be loving you. So my sin is being defined as, do I love you or do I not love you? Do I love God with everything that I have or do I not love God? And like newborn infants, we long for that pure spiritual milk, that distillation of the truth, that I can grow into my salvation, that instead of putting you into a box, I just ask you to love God and love your neighbor. And as a Christian fellowship, let me love you. and ask people around you to let you love them. And you do this if you've indeed tasted that the Lord is good. Bringing us back to the main point I brought, perfection is doing something with our salvation for the sake of our own character and the well-being of those around us. I would say that if you love God with everything that you are and you love your neighbor as much as you can, your character has no choice but to change. Now, there's some Christians that are going to be like, let me build a box for you. Let me build a list. Let me build something that you can meet and match and do so it's easy for you. And there will be some who will say, well, God's forgiveness is infinite, and tomorrow I can wake up and sin and be forgiven again. So there's no point in me actually trying to improve my character growth. And we have these poles, and honestly, they're both kind of built on Scripture, maybe a misinterpretation of it, but they both are trying to pull something out of the truth that we've been given. And I actually suggest that somewhere in the middle, sometimes those lists are helpful. Don't lie. I didn't lie today. Check. That's just really good and fulfilling. But the concept comes down to, if I start holding people to the list I create versus the love that God requests of them, that's the wrong thing. But if I absolve them of all accountability and all discipline, that's also just as bad. So somewhere in the middle, we have this idea that perfection is just loving God and loving people. Perfection is doing something with our salvation for the sake of our own character and the well-being of those around us. And as we walk away from this, I want to ask you, what is your Sharpie? What is your crayon? What is your expo marker? What is your pocket knife? What is your elbow through drywall? That you look at the house that God has given you and rented to you, and you see the black wall that God has remade and made new, and you have that urge to just mess it up again. And we're human, and so I know without a doubt you have that urge. And as we walk away from this, we have this question of how can I love God and love people better? I thought Daniel was walking up here. So Daniel, you can come on up here. I thought we were going to have a cleaner transition than that. Chris too, where's the Topher? So as we come into the space, we're going to have communion now to kind of remember Jesus' sacrifice for us. So during this last song, if you'd stand up with me while we get everything ready. During this last song, in the back, there's a table behind the pews with some crackers and juice. If you'd go gather, and then we'll come back up and take communion together. And I just want you to think about that idea of forgiveness and the fact that my character growth and my love for God and my love for others is all that is asked of me. And understanding that God came down and loved me so much to give his own invaluable life